We've talked over the course of the semester about different types of measurements and how we're going to collect data, but we're going to talk more intensively in this particular PowerPoint about how to go about doing that, particularly with quantitative and qualitative studies. There's a number of different types of measures that we can do, and I can tell you that when you move into your own research, this is going to be one of the most important questions that you're going to need to answer. And if I'm there while you do your proposal, I will certainly be asking you about your measurements. Measurements can come in a number of different forms. They can come in the form of tests, which are typically quantitative, questionnaires, which could be either because you could have open-ended or closed-ended questions, observations, which are exclusively qualitative, interviews, again qualitative, or documents, which could be either one because you could be recording factual data with tallies or percentages, or you could be looking at qualitative data if you're taking kind of snapshots from maybe students' files. You can find measurements from other researchers. There are lots of published measurements out there within the field. For example, if you wanted to learn about self-efficacy, you wanted to do student self-efficacy, you could go into the research and find measurements from researchers who have found the reliability and validity of a self-efficacy scale. That's what you would want to use. They aren't always published, but if you contact the researcher, they would send it to you in a heartbeat. So just know that there's the types of measurements that you're going to be using should have some sort of validity or reliability. You can create your own as a teacher, but you need to be prepared to really stand behind why you're using that particular measurement and to take into consideration whether it's a reliable and valid measurement that you're using. When you're looking at a quantitative study, there's a couple steps in the data collection process. And in a research article, you will see data collection as one of the primary headings. But normally the participants are outlined who is going to be studied. All the permissions are granted. So we're talking about everything that you get from IRB that gives consent to work with the participants. Now, when you're reading a research article, it may not say, consent was approved from the Human Subject Review Board. I gave everybody consent forms. They signed it. You may not read that in research. And typically you don't read that because there's an assumption that it has been done. No research should ever be done without having those permissions. So you need consent from anyone who's over 18 or assent from children who are participating in addition to the consent from their parents. So you'll get those permissions. You have to figure out what you're collecting. What information do I need to know? And sometimes that's where your measurements come in and what kind of measures are you using to find the information, because if you want to know whether something's working, you may not want to do an interview because that's not going to give you the hard data that you need. Selecting and locating instruments. So again, when I was talking about what measurements are you going to use, that should be outlined in the data collection. If you're going to look at teachers' effectiveness using a certain intervention, are you going to have some sort of observation sheet where you're actually, tallying whether or not they're staying in line with the fidelity of the program? And when you read research, you will see explicit information about measurements, and oftentimes it will tell you where the measurement came from. So they will cite researchers. So they will say, we used portions of this measurement, and then they'll cite Walker 2015, and we also used the introduction to the Crohn's alpha instrument, and then they will cite Brigham 2013, and tell you exactly where they got their measurements from. They're not just kind of pulling them out of the air. So when you're reading research and they're talking about data collection, take a look and see, where did they get this instrument from where? And oftentimes you'll see a trail in the research that goes back for years and years because an instrument was found to be reliable and valid, and then other researchers continue using it over the years, and that also continues to show its validity and reliability. But you can track that through kind of time. And the last thing is through the data collection is you'll see the actual administration of the data collection. So how that the researcher went about collecting the data, how did they go through the intervention, the observation form, the checklist, the interview process, what was the step-by-step procedure for collecting data. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about each of the things in the previous slide. And the first is kind of the who will be studied. When you're talking about who you're going to study, you have to think about what your unit of analysis is going to be, or when you're looking at the research, you have to figure out who are they talking about. You could be talking about one individual. You could go all the way to an entire classroom or an entire school, a county, a state. And I think in the research we've seen this semester, we've seen that range. You can look at national databases. You can look at two particular students doing a case study. All of those are okay. And you don't have to use the same unit of analysis when you're looking at independent and dependent variables, or even when you're looking at your research questions. When you're thinking about your research questions, you could have an individual student as one unit of analysis for one question, and you could have the entire classroom for the other research question. So don't get hung up on what level of analysis that you're looking at when you're reading about research and when you're looking at the data collection and even the data analysis, because that unit of analysis may change and shift a little bit depending on what the research questions are and what kind of measurements are being used. Going back to step 2 on the steps of the process of doing research, you have to obtain permissions. When you are obtaining permissions, and when any researcher is obtaining permissions, the very first level, that number one place that has to happen is the Institutional Review Board, and that's your human subjects review. So here at Mary Washington, you go through Mary Washington's campus approval. All research, all the research you read, all the researchers, they all go through their own university's consent review board. No one does research without doing that. It is all tracked, and it's through all disciplines across the nation. If you are working with children, you have to get parent permission. You have to get individual permission from the students, and that's assent as opposed to consent. And then you also have to get permission from the district, school district, and the school. So within the hierarchy of how you do this, you go university first. You would go to the school district to ask for permission. Then you would go to the classroom. Then you would go to parents. Then you would go students. And that is for research that's being published. For you as a researcher, and when you do your own projects, you do not have to go through the school district. You will have to go through Mary Washington's review, but you will get permissions through that classroom because you're not going to be publishing this information. You're just going to be using it for your research projects. So this kind of gives you that overview. All the data collection should be linked together. So when you're looking at what you're collecting, it should be matched to your research. So the very first thing you're going to do is identify the variable. What is it that I want to study? So for example, I'm going to look at self-efficacy for learning from others. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to define the variable. So what the heck does self-efficacy for learning mean? Well, it's a level of confidence that an individual can learn something by being taught by others. So as you're thinking about, or as you're reading research and you're trying to figure out what is this about, very early on, whatever variable is being researched, whatever variable is being studied, it should be defined. If you're looking at motivation, there should be a definition for what motivation is. What the heck are you talking about? If you are going to look at math calculation interventions, whatever intervention you're looking at, or even math calculation, what specifically are you talking about? It should be something that is so concrete that anyone who is reading your research or reading the research should know exactly what is being discussed. So you have to operationally define that. The next thing you want to focus on is the data. How do I get at this information? Am I going to use an observation? And am I going to use some sort of document? Am I going to use a questionnaire? So the example I gave you was a self-efficacy scale from Bergen. And that scale was developed in 1989. So I went through the research and I found a scale that really worked for me. And that's where it originated from, was Bergen, who developed this. And then the last thing I'm going to do is collect that data on instruments that are going to give me some numeric scores when I'm looking at quantitative data. And that could be, as the example, anything from 0 to 10, with 10 being completely confident. So this is kind of the progression of how that you get ready for your data collection given what variables you have and what questions you're asking within the research. When looking at data collection, again, you want to examine different instruments that are going to measure what you want to know. And this could be anything from a performance measure to behavior measure, factual measures, any of those types of measurements. Any of these are fair game, and I'll show you in the next slide how you go about finding these. The easiest place to find some sort of instrument, or the place that you see most common when you're reading research, is from other published research articles. So if you're reading a study, you'll see that they've used a certain measurement. Again, they've cited a researcher. You want to go to the reference section of that paper and then search for that article specifically. You can actually search for descriptors of instruments. So if you're looking for a self-efficacy scale, you would go in and type that in as your keyword. Or if you're looking for a math computation scale for kindergartners, you would click that in there. You can check something called Test and Print or Mental Measurements Yearbook, and those things you can just Google and find, and they give you a list of different measurements, or you can develop your own. Just know that if you're developing your own measurement when you're working through research, you have to be really careful with how you're phrasing your questions, with whether or not your measurement actually matches your research questions. Are you actually getting at the information based on what you want to know? And you have to consider whether or not your instrument is reliable and valid. And you can't necessarily run statistical tests on your own measurements at this point, but having somebody else critique them and look through them to give you some feedback is oftentimes very helpful. As you're considering what makes an instrument good or worth using, you want to think about a couple of things, considerations. Some of these are not necessarily good or bad. Some are definitely good or definitely bad, but is it a recent instrument? Has it had time to really run through the course of tests that tell us if it's reliable or valid? Is it widely used by other authors? If it's something that you see a lot in the research, chances are it's being used for good reason. Probably because it's a pretty good instrument. Can you find any reviews for that particular instrument? Sometimes you'll see critiques of the instruments if you do a search, keyword search for them. If there's a procedure for recording the data that really fits with what you're doing. So is it a good match for you? It may be a good instrument, but does it really match your research question? Does it have scales of measurement? So is it going to give you the data you need in the end? It may answer your question, but are you really going to get that hard data that you're looking for? And I've been talking all along about reliability and validity, because if you have that, you have a lot more to stand on when it comes to choosing a good instrument. And oftentimes it'll tell you specifically, this is the reliability, this is the validity of this particular instrument. So you can make a judgment call based on that. And we'll talk a little bit about what makes a good score for reliability and validity. Using tests is one way to get at information. If you're trying to do some data collection, you need to know that there's two different types. There's norm, reference, and criterion. Norm, reference are interpreted based on a group. So it places you within a group somewhere. You're in the 95th percentile, the 50th percentile. It kind of gives you a rank. And then if you're talking about criterion, it's relative to some standard or criterion, whether you pass or you don't pass, or you meet some sort of cutoff. When you're talking about standardized tests, know that there's different kinds. There's achievement test and aptitude test and standards. You have some high stakes testing, and all of those are fine. The nice thing about standardized tests is that they have uniform procedures for scoring, for administration, and for interpretation. So it's pretty cut and dry if you decide to use some sort of test. So this is an example of a standardized score. So when we're talking about standardized scores in terms of norming within a group, you can see that both SAT scores and a grade equivalent score are both considered to be standard scores. When you use standardized scores, the nice thing as well about using those is that you can transform them into standard metrics. So oftentimes we will take a raw score and turn it into a D-score. And Z-score. What the Z-score is the difference between the raw score and the mean and standard deviation unit.